An interesting thing, what I'm going to share with you isn't anything new from what the brothers have already said. So in some sense, it's going to be a little bit of a review. What I am going to do that is new or different is I'm going to give you an exam at the end. So like any good teacher, you're going to get an exam or a quiz at the end and see what you have remembered or recalled. The brother right before me talked about how when technology breaks, it can be the person who repairs it who first sees what that person was involved with before the particular thing broke. We bought a vehicle for my wife from the auction, and the insurance company was selling it after it had been in an accident and squashed. And after that, we had taken it apart, we fixed things in the engine, we welded on a new frame to it, and we turned it on, and guess what we found when we turned it on and found what was in the CD player? There were 3 possibilities of discs that could be in the CD player, and the only disc that was in the CD player was a disc of the reading of the New Testament. It showed us what somebody's last moments before they were involved in the car accident, what they were interested in, or at least what was important to them to be in that vehicle. Beforehand, when I worked on the fire department in Michigan, I clearly remember responding to a particular house, a particular place, and this house, we were told there was a young man who had a heart attack. We arrive at the house, and the front door is locked, and I was the first person from our department to arrive. So we walk around the neighbor's property, over the fence in the back, and enter into the back door of the house, and we find this young man in the basement. He was in the basement, in a room, and on the wall was a screen with terrible pictures, and he was entirely naked. He was involved in a sexual sin, and he had a heart attack partway through that. He ended up dying, passing away in the hospital, but 2 different circumstances of what people are involved in when they don't expect to be interrupted. Something happened when they weren't expecting it. For me, I really enjoy new things. I enjoy discovering things, I enjoy finding new applications for things, and I enjoy new technology as well. And yet, the technology has rapidly developed over the years. So every new year brings some sort of new technological advantage that we can see and use. I remember my grandfather talking about the first time when his family received a telephone call from a state away. And this is the type of telephone he used, and this was his classroom when he was a student many years ago. And everybody in the house had to be very quiet so they could actually hear what the person, their relative from several states away, was actually trying to tell them about. And that was something that was new and exciting and interesting to them. I remember the first time I myself used a radio. That radio talked to a station, that station connected it to a telephone, and I thought, this is amazing. I'm sitting in a car, driving down the road, able to talk on the radio, have it go and call somebody while they're in their house on the telephone. Well, today, things are so much different with our own telephones that we carry around. So technology has changed a lot, it is changing, and it's growing very rapidly. Interestingly, about 60 years ago, people predicted that in the 21st century, we would have something like this. We would have cars that would fly around and enable us to take ourselves from our house to the store, go different places, visit friends, and it'd be a very fast way to travel and a very quick method to do a lot of things. Yet, interestingly, today, we don't have overly crowded skies. There aren't accidents of flying cars going around. No, we don't quite see flying cars today. But what we do have is so much more advanced than what people 60 years dreamed about. Today, we're able to go online to a site, we're able to order something, and depending on where we live, it can show up at my house within a couple of hours. I can go shopping at the grocery store online and have somebody deliver that produce to my doorstep, still refrigerated. Instead of having some device that takes me everywhere, now other things can come to me. In the past, they were thinking that we could go and visit with other people quickly. But yet today, for very low cost, we can talk and even actually see each other using technology such as Skype, Viber, FaceTime, Talkie, Uvu, Appear, or WhatsApp. All of those allow us to communicate with someone far away when it would not be possible for us to go and visit them. So while what we predicted 60 years ago is not happening now, what we do have is actually so much more advanced, so much more fascinating, and so much more interesting. In the 1960s, there was a man, Moore, and Moore is related to the company Intel, and he made an observation that became known as Moore's Law. And what he said is that basically every year, the amount of transistors or the amount of the electrical switches that make up a computer are able to become half the size that they were the year before. So starting from about 1960, every year, my technology, what used to be a telephone this size back then, could the next year become half that size. Or, if I maintain the same size, then it becomes twice as powerful or twice as fast. From that prediction, throughout time, we actually see that it follows pretty closely that trend. So every year, we're practically doubling the power of things that we use in the technology that's available to us. I was a student back where Google was born, and I actually remember the first Google server that was built out of Duplo type of Lego blocks with its hard drives inside it. And it's interesting how much that one company has even changed the technology that we have today. We have adopted, we have used to use technology in our everyday tasks, and often that makes our lives easier. Today there is an estimated little over 23 billion devices that are connected to the internet at any one time. What that means is that for every single man, woman, child, infant that's in the entire world, there's an average of 3 devices that are connected for them. It's amazing how many things are connected to what we call the internet. In 2016, more than 20 terabytes of information were transferred every second throughout the internet. What that means is that in about 8 days, every single iPhone anywhere on the earth would be completely full of the data that gets transmitted via the internet. The internet allows so much data to be transferred and downloaded. Douglas Adams came up with 3 different classes of people. And he says this: I've come up with a set of rules that describes our reactions to technology. Anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and is just a natural part of the way the world works. So when I'm born up to about 15 years old, that technology is just something that I'm used to. It's in the world, I see it, I understand how it works, it's just everything that I know. And then we end up with another age group, a middle age group, and this is anything that's invented between when I'm 15 and 35 is technology that is new. It's exciting, it's fascinating, I'm interested in it. And probably I can find a life work or a career dealing and working with this new technology. And that could become my own work. And then according to Douglas, the third group is anything that's invented after I'm 35 is against the natural order of things. Or in other words, that technology can be confusing. I have to work hard to understand it and actually apply it. So 3 different groups from when I'm young to when I'm older, and how we naturally adapt or naturally adopt that particular technology. Technology is advancing. It is changing our lives, and it is here to stay. Rarely, if ever, can we undo technology. We can choose not to use it, but it's practically impossible to actually get rid of it in the world. So technology is changing, it's here to stay, but the question comes with, what do we do? Do we actually go and adopt it or not? There was a book written by a professor at the school where I was a student, and this book I actually require of all of my engineering students to read as well. And what's fascinating is that a lot of missionaries are also required to read the same book. It's a very technical, very thick book, but it talks about the diffusion or the acceptance of innovation, and it documents case after case of technology that gets invented, that gets accepted by people, and then gets used by them. And we can divide it up into multiple different groups, depending on how early we choose to jump onto a new thing, when we want to use it, versus if we're the later people who are very concerned about it, and then we start to use it later on. A particular technology can be a good invention or a good innovation, but it may fail to diffuse or be used by many other people. When I was young, there was a company called Creative. They came up with a little MP3 music player, which started to replace the little portable CD players that people would have. It failed to diffuse. Very few people bought it, and ultimately, it disappeared. The iPod, which back in that day wasn't nearly as advanced, it went through and it actually got adopted and kind of became the precursor to what became the iPhone that we all know about today. Difference in this process of what do I choose to adopt or not. Interestingly, you can break down the different things that motivate a technology to get used into 4 different areas. Number 1, that innovation has to itself work well and be successful. Number 2, you have to have communication channels or ways for other people to learn about that new technology. It always takes time for people to adopt or change to something new, and the social system in which it is adopted has a big effect on that particular technology. For example, many of us here don't use the same instant messaging app that everybody in China uses. Our social system is different in the Western world than the Eastern part of the world. And so that innovation is also different. Technology itself can help with the spread of the gospel of Christ. And even the gospel of God spreads like technology has spread in the past. And that is one reason why a lot of missionaries are required to understand and read how this works. We understand it, we use it, and we can apply it in our life. Now, one thing that I am fascinated with is the way that Christians in the past have been quick to adopt and use new technology to further the kingdom of God. And perhaps a reason for this is that if we think about who is the God of technology, where does technology come from? We discover that when God created the world, He built into the world the principles and the way things work such that we can come along and we can make discoveries and we can apply those things and use it in new technology. In other words, everything that we invent or innovate is really just reordering or using the principles that God created in the world already. So if we think about it that way, we need to be grateful to God for the technology that He has allowed us to discover, to find, and to use as well. We should be thankful to Him for the technology that saves us time, for the ways that it helps me, that enables me to understand and use it, but always use that technology for the purposes of God. Just as God created the world with technology, with the basis or the principles for technology in it, Satan also tries to copy or divert that praise that should go to God to others. And in the culture we live in, we end up looking up to somebody who has made an invention, looking up to a company that does well and is successful, thinking a lot about those things. And that is Satan trying to capture that praise that should be God's and redirects it towards other people. As a student, I had one young man who also worked in the same lab as mine. One afternoon, he came into the laboratory, and he was so excited. His face was glowing, and he was just so amazed at what had happened that he couldn't sit down for a while. He was walking back and forth, and I asked him, what was it that made you so excited? And he said, I was in another office here at the university, and this man walked in and sat down next to me. And for 20 minutes, I was talking to this man, and I even shook his hand. And that's what made his day. Who was that man? Steve Jobs from Apple. Just having met this man, spending 20 minutes talking with him, was probably the high point of this guy's life for that year. You see what Satan tries to do? He tries us to value, even idolize, people who make discoveries of God's creation instead of praising God for his own creation. Really, the glory should be God's. Technology is exciting. It's fascinating. It's useful. And technology itself should be a blessing to us. It should bless us. What I find fascinating is that Christians have often been the early adopters and users of technology. This is a reproduction of a printing press that Gutenberg made back in around 1439. So more than 500 years ago, he invented the idea of movable type printing, a way to make many copies of a certain thing. What was the first major work that Gutenberg published on his printing press? The Bible. He used it to print the Word of God. Guess what the most expensive book is anywhere in the world today? One of those first Bibles that Gutenberg printed. Why? It's the first book that used the printing technology, that new technology of the day, to create something. Why was it used? It was used to create the Word of God and to allow its distribution. When I was young, I went to a very special museum that's now closed, but it was in West Michigan, and I saw a Gutenberg Bible there. It was preserved, and it was fascinating to see the most expensive book in the world. At that same place, there were other interesting Bibles to see at the scriptorium, such as a Bible that somebody who was being burned for their faith had his Bible thrown into the fire with him. In the process of him losing his life and being burned, he reached down and grabbed that Bible and threw it out into the crowd. That Bible was at the same museum as the Gutenberg Bible, stained with the blood of that person who gave his life for Christ. Printing hasn't been the only technology used by Christians. In the 1940s, there was a mission group that started using aircraft to help missionaries in other countries. Then a little bit later on, there were Christian groups that started using shortwave radio to broadcast messages into countries that were closed, such as the former Soviet Union. Years ago, I operated a radio station in Texas that broadcasted continuously every hour of the day and night to 1.1 million people that lived in that particular area. Christians use technology to advance God's kingdom. And often, we can be some of the first to use and invent it. There's a group down in South America that had trouble with their antennas at their broadcast station. They invented a new type of antenna that now gets used in other broadcast stations. What were they doing? They're broadcasting godly programming via shortwave radio. In 2009, Steve Saint, who is a son of a missionary along with Jim Elliot and 3 others who were killed in South America, he was given an award from the Popular Mechanics group for a particular aircraft that people in the jungle, specifically the tribe that had killed his father, could use as technology to spread the gospel itself. And then recently at a student computer coding challenge, I was talking with an engineer from Amazon who was using new technology of machine learning to help multilingual churches. The idea was that somebody would end up going through translating what they would speak about and display it for people in their congregation who would think in a different language. And while the more a person would go and put in their information into the system, then the better and better the system becomes in translating something. That is an example of something that Christians use to advance the kingdom of God, technology for his purposes. Technology can be effective in the gospel, and it's important for us as Christians to understand, to look, to invent, to innovate, and to use that for God's purposes. Regardless, one thing is clear and imperative. We must invest. We must adopt. We must invent those technologies to be used by God, and never ever for my own desires or for my own things that I like. Okay, there are a couple of concerns that we have when we talk about technology. And this doesn't involve just the Christian perspective, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but these things are overarching. The first thing that concerns us when we talk about technology is the fact that it's very easy for us to trust the things that we find. In the US, anything that's used to create something of importance or to measure something has to get certified back to a local regional office. That local regional office certifies that back to a national office, and that national office goes and certifies it back to where the exact, say, kilogram weighs, which is in Paris. And there's this traceability or this path to make sure that what I have actually is measuring the right thing. The only problem is that when we're online, it's easy for us to find information that doesn't trace itself back to something that is true or accurate. It used to be, if I needed to find good information, I would go and look for a book or an article that would have that, and I might have to go and order it from another library to be sent in, but when it arrived, I could find that information, and likely it was good and it was accurate. Because that book had been proofread by multiple people before the publishers would even publish it. Nowadays, it's easy to find answers online to all sorts of things. But it's also easy to find false answers online as well. One teacher I had purposely asked us a question to go and research a certain topic, but he didn't tell us, and he created a fake website that had that question and the answer to that question posted. Any student who went online and did a search for that question would come across his website, which of course didn't say it was his website, copy down the answer, and every student who did that failed. Why? Because it showed that they weren't careful enough to discern whether that information was actually valid or not. They were too lazy to go and actually investigate it. It was, that was a poor source, and it was obviously that they had trusted a poor source. So always evaluate and monitor any information you find to ensure it makes sense, to verify it, and make sure that it is something that follows so that you're not led astray after someone else's will. I'm very concerned when someone comes to me and they tell me about something, and then partway through they have some little word such as, oh, this is what I believe because I watched it somewhere on YouTube. or somebody said it. And yet those same people, when we share with them something from God's Word, start to find a way why that Bible verse is not applicable to them in their life. What do we trust? What is our source? Second is similar. That in a connected world with technology, it is easy to let a computer do much more thinking for us than what we should be doing ourselves. I always teach my students to think about what the correct range for the output should be before I actually go through that process of finding it, to make sure and double check to see if I've made a mistake somewhere along the way. If we rely too much on the GPS navigator to give us directions, too much on the internet to tell me the answers to any problem, then it becomes less important for me to think and even less important for me to remember things. And once I stop thinking and once I stop remembering things, then it's very easy for a spring from a bad source to come and influence me. The third general concern involves the idea that the things we do online are often not as secret as most people think they should be. We think that the things in our online presence is something that's private, and yet that may not be the case. The information and data is valuable to a company, and there is a cost that is associated with that. When you travel with your phone using navigation turned on or even location, you often pay for the service of a map by giving the company that's giving you that access an idea of where you are, when you are, so that they can figure out how fast is the traffic moving, what time is the store open, and how many people visit the store during that time. You think it might be private, and yet that information is useful to the company itself. And even without location, companies are very good at being able to determine where you are by something as simple as the air pressure in that region and the air pressure your device actually measures. There's a man I work with, and he's in engineering, computer engineering, and he developed a method that automatically runs a sort on Twitter messages. You've probably seen a Twitter message. It's very short, very succinct. What you may not know is that the back side of it, in other words, the hidden information of it, includes the location of where that tweet came from. And what this man has done is he's gone and he sorts those Twitter messages and scans for certain words. And over time, the computer software has understood, sorted, and become smart enough so that he looks at the Twitter message, he looks at the location where it comes from, and he can predict whether a crime is going to happen or not. And that prediction of that crime, he already knows the location as well. And the police already dispatch policemen to that location for a crime even before anybody has called in that said that somebody has broken into my house. So that's the idea of the information that occurs and is transferred online when people think that they're anonymous or just talking with their friends. That analysis is happening. People think that they are private and anonymous, and often that is false. Years ago, the first time I was at the Google headquarters, I was involved in a user study there, and I remember clearly a screen, and on that screen was scrolling past things that people were searching for in real time. It was just flying past the screen what people were typing into their search engine. It was a shock. Most people interact with it thinking that I'm the person who's seeing it, it's serving me. And yet that information goes somewhere else and is even displayed in other places as well. Years ago, I studied with a young man named Lucas Ilves. I clearly remember one evening I was having dinner together with him and described something that had happened in the country he came from, the country of Estonia. In that situation, attackers completely crippled the country's government services for 2 days. How? The attackers used computers in the US and Canada with malware to use it to attack that government system. Often, the people whose computers were infected, whose telephones were used for that, had no idea that it was their computer, their telephone, that was being used in the attack. For those of you, if anyone here is from Estonia, you might recognize that Lucas is the son of Tuomas, who is a president of Estonia from 2006 to 2016. Now, that attack was made using malware, but there are many other ways that we expose ourselves, we give our personal information away by using certain apps, programs, and websites. If many of us were asked 15 years ago if we liked the idea of having some device attached to our car or strapped to our belt such that the government or private companies could know where I was, even perhaps listen to the things I'm saying, characterize my voice, or even gain access to the camera that's attached to that, many of us would refuse. And yet today, many of us use the technology that could be used in that way. We carry and we use it. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the Christian principles and how we should respond to them. Thank you. So what is the Christian response? Well, the first thing is that I am not going to give you a list of the things that you can go to, technology you can use, or technology that you cannot use. I won't do that. It's much better for us to think about what the brothers before me mentioned when they talked about the principles or the ways we can evaluate something and see, is that important for me or not? It's those biblical principles that will discern whether I am going to live with technology in a right manner or not. The Bible applies to the things we face today. We as preachers are to warn about those things. We are to speak about it. We are to train the people that we encounter in a practical way and a way that is applicable to us. A critical aspect is that we understand this one truth. And this truth says this: I am going to be personally responsible to God. I'm going to be responsible to Him for how I use or misuse technology. And I'm going to be responsible to God for my technology regardless of whether the church itself says that I can use that or if the church says I cannot use that. I am still responsible to God for the technology that I use. Just because the church says that I can use something doesn't mean that I need to run out the next day and buy it. It might not be right for me. So we have to think about it. We need to take personal responsibility and calculate to understand if that technology is something that is useful to me or not. We are going to be held responsible before God for the things that we do. Now, these different principles are like a set of glasses that we can put on as Christians. And we put on those glasses and we can look at a particular technology and see if it matches those principles, see if it's useful to us, or see if it blocks it out as something for us to avoid. These are my own personal principles. These are the things that I use in my own life to decide what I am involved with or what I am not. You may think about them. We've heard a bunch of other ones as well today, which are also all wonderful principles. There are 5, and the first one is this: does this technology meet the current standards of the church where I attend and my authorities? So here we have to think about, we like being gods. We like being in charge of something. We enjoy making decisions. We like having that choice. But yet, am I willing to be submissive to the things that my church tells me? Back when I lived in a different place in the U.S., I was a member of a different one of our brotherhood churches. And I was asked to create a website that had the church address and the times of the service. We made that website, and we had visitors who came to the church because they saw where the church was and what time it was. About 2 months afterwards, we were told by the district that that website was forbidden. We took it down. Now, I personally am not against a website that has a church address and the time of the service. But yet I understand the blessing of being submissive to whatever our church authorities have decided for us. Hebrews 13:17 says, "Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you." We also need to be careful of our civic authorities. When I live here in the U.S., I am careful that I do not use, I do not share, I do not download stolen, pirated software. That's something that I don't do. I don't download, use, or share illegal music copies or other items that are protected. In other words, I am accountable to the rules of the government where I live, and I strive to live by those. That goes beyond just the internet, but includes things like copying homeschooling videos that are set and are not to be copied, or curriculum, or Christian media. I live by that because that is a standard that is set for me, and I believe that God can bless me by living by that standard. Now, if I'm in a different country that doesn't have those same laws, then I might not be held to that same standard. But for me here, that's what I live by. Number 2, will I be free from exposure to harm and unwanted evil through this technology? In engineering, we go through a very specialized process of thinking about everything that could possibly go wrong with a particular product before we actually go and market and make it and sell it. The same thing we need to do as Christians here. Think about what could go wrong with this technology and what can I do to correct it, protect myself, or stop me from those dangers. For example, will the technology I use allow anybody to question my purity? Will my privacy be maintained? Will that information that I share across that technology jeopardize somebody in my church, myself, my family? Will there be pictures or advertisements or images that I have no control over that are going to show up? What is possible that could harm me or be evil to me? Write this down. This one psalm, Psalm 101 in English or Psalm 100 in Russian, perhaps matches the most closely to the principles of technology. I won't take the time to read it now, but go home and read it. Understand what it says. Am I careful to never set anything in front of my eyes that would be wrong before God? It talks about all of those different things. Third, will this technology encourage a godly attitude in my life? That's a question. Or is it possible that this particular technology is going to feed my pride? Think about social pressure. Social pressure comes from my pride. I want to look better in front of my friends, and so I go and I'm influenced by what they say. We want respect. We want admiration because of our pride in ourselves. We want the latest technology. We want to be smart about that technology. Is that feeding, or could that feed my own pride? Someone said it's amazing how much a person can accomplish when they aren't worried about who gets the credit. My name, Daniel, has the meaning, God is my judge. And yet, I have to ask myself the question, do I live as if God is my judge or not? There are a lot of online spaces, and it's easy for us to separate our physical identity from our online identity. Online, we can choose what our avatar is. We can choose what we say about ourselves. We can show a certain perspective that might be different from who I am in real life. I can keep updating many people about the things I want to share with them. But yet, I keep them from seeing other sides. It's easier to have a friend who lives a long ways away and only sees what I share with them through social media than it is to have a friend who I live with who sees me night and day and the real me. It's easy to separate our online presence from our physical presence. Will this technology help me to be grateful and thankful to God, or will I be tempted to keep something a secret? Gossip, will it feed jealousy, greed, lust, or envy? Those are questions I have to ask myself. Can we say that we have the mind of Christ? 1 Corinthians 2:16 says this, but we have the mind of Christ. Do I have the mind of Christ? Does it show in the attitude that my technology supports? Fourth, will it be a wise use of my time? Some things are not right or wrong. But ask the question, is this thing worth my time? God gave us time to use. We need to be intentional about how we use it. A rich person cannot buy himself more time. How do we use the time that God gives us? My father taught us to always think about taking something I have and trading it for something of more value. For example, I take my time when I'm young and I trade it for knowledge by going to school. Then I take my time and my knowledge and trade it when I work for money. I take that money and I trade that money to buy food to feed my family. We always need to trade our resources for something that's more valuable. That's one reason why my father never allowed us to play computer games. And that's why to this day, I do not play a computer game. I don't want to take my valuable time and spend it on something of lesser value. If you've ever been into a prison, you will encounter people who do not want to be there. It's rare that you will find a person who thinks that they're trading their time sitting in prison for something more valuable. Right? Do we ask that of ourselves? Today it is easy to know a lot, but understand very little. Wisdom is a practical application of knowledge. So I ask the question, am I wise? Can I take that knowledge and actually apply it in my own life? Temptation of technology is that I will lack focus. I will lack memory. I will stop thinking about the things that I'm doing. Because it's so available, it's easy for us to think that we can access it any time in the future. But yet, there are some people who tried to arrive to youth camp way up in the mountains once, who for some reason were thinking that their telephone navigation would work way up where there was no service. And one particular young man spent about 3 hours driving till he found camp. It's easy for us to always think that that information is going to be there for us. One thing that I do, when I'm tempted to look up something or search for something, I write it down in a list. And then the next day I go back to that list and I evaluate, is it really important to me to think about what the biggest elephant in the world weighed? Or something else? And often I find that half of those things are not really that valuable or useful to me, and it's not worth my time to investigate them. Not necessarily wrong, not necessarily evil, but maybe not the best use of my time. Trivia is defined as information that is of little or no value. And that's often the sort of information that we look up online. Something that I won't necessarily actually use in my own life. And then 5. Will my family, church, and sphere of influence benefit? Or is this only for me? The very first brother talked about, the selfie syndrome. A very famous person who had the selfie syndrome was Adolf Hitler. Think about it. What are we feeding? Even the etymology or the meaning of selfie screams me. Me, look at me. It's often easier to have a long-distance relationship than a relationship with somebody who's close to us. Is technology giving me more time to spend with my family and church, or is it taking my attention away? Chick-fil-A in 2016 started a program. They were concerned families would come to their restaurant, they would order a meal, and then spend the whole meal looking at their device instead of actually talking together as a family. So they started a program where families would be given what's called a coop, and that coop would enable families to put all of their phones and devices into it, and if that coop stayed closed and shut for the entire meal, so that the family could actually connect and have a relationship amongst themselves, and if they didn't touch their device during that period, then every person received free ice cream at the end of the meal. They were concerned about the amount of time people are spending looking at their device instead of connecting to the people who are close by. Having a shallow relationship with people 5 states away than with someone who's sitting right next to you who could be your brother or sister. Does technology interrupt this time with my family? Am I controlled by the technology? We heard about that from the first brother. Does it replace the attention I'm supposed to be giving to others? Technology and online activity can cause us to be influenced more by people who are distant than people who are close by. I can be drawn to answering or solving a problem that somebody emailed me from a long ways in Russia than taking care of the problems of my immediate family or the care of my wife. We often think that debate helps, and yet debate often doesn't change people, even though we often think that we can change them by online debate of certain topics. Finally, is the use of this technology a witness and example to my siblings, friends, church, and family? Are they benefiting from it? Or is this technology for me, for myself? In Ephesians 5:15 through 17, it says, "See that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore, be not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is." Walk circumspectly means walk diligently, walk carefully, walk perfectly with respect to technology. In conclusion, these 5 points help me evaluate technology and see, is that technology something useful for me or not? Matthew 10:16 says that we are sent out by God as sheep among wolves. We have to be careful about that. So when I think about my responsibility before God, I think about those 5 areas. There are certain technologies that fail those 5 areas for me in my own life. I'm not a minister. I'm not a pastor. I'm not here to tell you, and I wouldn't want to tell you, what is okay for you and what is not okay for you. But to give you a practical example, these are the things that I stay away from. Maybe it's not evil, but maybe I don't see the value or the use of my time spent in that. So I never go to YouTube. I'm not on Viber, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, Facebook, Odnoklassniki, MySpace, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. Never play phone games, computer games, and I'm very careful with what forums I read, and even more so with any that I actually post to. That is my own personal standard, just so that you get a practical example of what I'm talking about. Why? I want to be as the words of Jesus in John 8:29. Jesus said this, "And he that sent me is with me. The Father hath not left me alone, for I do always those things that please him." I want to always do those things that please him, that please God. My friend, we're in a war. This war is real. This is a battle, and the enemy is attacking one house, and it's moving on into the bedroom of another house, and it's slowly capturing people by people, even inside the same family. If you've read this book by John Bunyan, it's called The Holy War, and it talks about a person who is represented by a city in the book, and Satan is attacking that city, and he attacks that city in one of the 5 gates that surround that city. And those gates are the gates of our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and so on. Satan often gets a foothold in our life through one of those senses. If you haven't read this book, I recommend that you actually read through it. In Mark 5, 1 through 13, we read about a time when Jesus came and met a person who was controlled by evil spirits. And the evil spirits understood that Jesus was going to send them out of the man and make the man well. And they asked God, and they said to Jesus, "Don't send us out into the deep, into the dark place. Instead, see these pigs. These pigs are over here. Send us into those pigs instead." Now, in the New Testament, we often see how when God or Jesus says something, Satan has to obey. But why, when the demons asked to go into the pigs, did Jesus allow them to actually go into the pigs? I think the answer is in what happens next. What happened to all those pigs? It says that they all ran away. They ran a steep place in the hill into the Sea of Galilee and drowned. 2,000 pigs committed suicide all at once. From one side, it seems like the demons got their way. But from the other side, imagine the man who had just been controlled by those demons. He saw with his own eyes what Satan and those demons wanted to do with his life. In John 10:10, it says this, "The thief cometh not, but for to steal and to kill and to destroy." What happened to those pigs? They were stolen. They were stolen from the farmers. They had no control over those 2,000 anymore. They didn't listen to them. Second purpose of Satan is to kill. What happened to the pigs? 2,000 of them died. And they didn't just die in a way that somebody could come along and cut up the bacon and take it home. No, they're drowned. They're in the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. They were destroyed. Satan's purpose is to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And perhaps God allowed those evil demons to enter into the pigs to show that man and to show us what Satan wants for us. But God doesn't stop there. The second part of John 10:10 says this, "I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." Whatever Satan has for you online, whatever he tempts you with online, God has for you something that's better, a life that's more abundant, something for us. In Matthew 7, verse 13, it says to enter in that straight gate, that narrow way, that difficult path that leads to God. But yet few are the people who actually find it and live it and travel by it. Okay, 1 in 7 people in the U.S. are addicted. 1 in 7. I'm not proud of it for my country. But you pass 7 people walking down the sidewalk, by statistics, one of them is addicted to something. And addictions to things on the phone or online, computer games, actually changes the physiology of somebody. And scientifically, you can understand that those changes can cause a connection that's as strong as alcohol or drug abuse. That can happen to a person. It can happen to things. That's why I titled my talk, "The Sleeping Serpent You're Holding." Probably every single one of us has access to some smart device, some computer somewhere, and we're holding this serpent. What do we do about it? Billy Graham was a man, and while I don't agree with everything that he said, way back many years ago, he was at a meeting in Modesto, California, and he and his team came together to discover the 4 areas that most pastors who find themselves in trouble have sinned by. And he made a purpose in his life to stay away from these 4 areas. And whether you agree with everything of his theology or not, for someone who is as well known, he hasn't had the trouble that so often plagues other people. The first thing is sexual temptations. He would never ever be in a place with a woman alone other than his wife. It caused trouble for so many other pastors. That was a choice that he made. He found out that money caused problems. And so he himself never ever handled or managed money. That was all done by other people. Power influenced. And because of this, a lot of times people were drawn to inflate their statistics. Say, so many people came to my meeting, or so many people repented, or there are so many baptisms. In fact, Dwight L. Moody, who lived more than 100 years ago, never ever kept statistics of everything, so that he could never become proud of anything like that. He didn't know. And the last thing is criticism of others. He avoided criticizing other people. People answer to God for their own actions. His purpose was to teach what was right. It was spoken of him that he did seem to have a passion of the pure. But never ever for a moment did he think that he or anybody else was strong enough that they could never be tempted. So in other words, he had certain standards for himself to keep him from being tempted. Bill Perkins said this: if you think you can't fall into sexual sin, then you're godlier than David, stronger than Samson, and wiser than Solomon. In other words, if we become proud ourselves and think, no, I don't need to be careful in this area, I don't need to be careful there, well, here are 3 people in the Bible who are actually amazing people, much better than me, much smarter than I am, and they had trouble. This problem is real for us. So leaving all the other items aside that has to do with the internet or our online presence, I'm going to focus on one small area and some statistics for it. It says in 1 Corinthians 9:27, "But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway." This problem is a problem of pornography. Pornography is a major problem among us as Christians. It is defined as writing about harlots and prostitutes. So writing about harlots or prostitutes is the definition. Or another definition, writing pictures, films, or other things designed to stimulate sexual excitement. So something that's designed to do that is pornography. When I was young, my father told me about evil people who would put bad magazines in plastic bags and then leave them close to the sidewalk of where boys or young children would walk. Why? Just as a drug dealer tries to get people hooked on some drug so that they can then supply it. My father warned me about that. when I was young. Today, the attacks are different. Instead of coming in magazines that are left so that somebody is curious and goes and finds them and opens them and becomes addicted, today it's available through any online source. Just 55% of adults in the U.S. believe pornography is wrong. So we understand that it's a sin. But yet, in the people we live with, only about half of them think that's correct. That's sad. And only 24% of adults believe that a naked picture is actually pornography. There'll be a lot of people who say, oh no, that's art instead. Less than 1/4 of people, of adults here in the U.S., believe that that is pornography. Knowledge of evil, at first, is repulsive to us as Christians. Just like encountering a rattlesnake, you step quietly back, you're careful with. Or those who are afraid of a spider, you see it, and you kind of jump. But yet, repeated exposure to it, to wickedness, eventually brings callousness to it, and it no longer appears so evil. It no longer appears so sinful. Young adults, aged 13 to 24, believe that not recycling, so you drink your soda, and not taking that soda can and dropping it into the recycling bin, is twice as bad as using pornography. Those with an undergraduate college degree are more likely to sin with pornography than those without. And what is interesting is that people in the world will say, oh, the problem or the solution to sin is that we just have to learn more. And the more we learn, then we won't want to sin anymore. Well, the statistics in the U.S. actually show us that if I have an undergraduate college degree, then it's more likely for me to sin with pornography. Currently, there are over 28,000 users who are spending more than $3,000 each second accessing pornography. That's a lot. That's a problem. And 35%, more than 1/3 of all internet downloads relate to pornography. Remember I talked about that 20 terabytes every second that's being transferred by the internet? More than 1/3 of that relates to something that is evil and something that is sinful. Telephones. 1 in every 5 searches on a telephone is for pornography. That means if I search for something that's valid 4 times, somebody else next to me is searching the 5th time for something that's not right. People think it's private. People think it's okay, and yet it causes a big problem. By and large, men prefer images, but women prefer stories, romance sites, and romance novels. By the way, by the definition of pornography, romance novels are included. Okay, it's a writings about that romance. Yet, practically 1/3 of college-age young women use pornography regularly. In addition to whatever romance novels or romance books they involve in. More than 2/3 of divorce cases involve one party meeting a new lover over the internet. And 64% of Christian men in the U.S. use pornography regularly. That's scary. That's something that we have to address. That's not something that we can ignore or close our eyes to. This is even sadder. Churches who call themselves fundamentalists, such as us in our brotherhood, not all Baptists, but the conservative Baptists, are actually 91% more likely to sin with pornography than the average public in the U.S. What's going wrong in our churches? What's going wrong with our young people? What's going wrong in my life that this becomes a statistic? Now, I hope and pray that that's not true for us. But just by the number of statistics, we have to be careful. We have to watch out for this. 1 in every 7 lead pastors in the United States uses pornography regularly. 1 in 7 of the pastors. And if you have a pastor who works with young people in the U.S., 1 in every 5 of those regularly sins with pornography. This isn't talking about the people yet. This is talking about the people who are supposed to train the people, to teach us. That's sobering. 43% of pastors say that they struggled with pornography. And by statistics, we would have a problem as well. Now, in the beginning I said that we need to use technology. That technology is exciting, it's useful, it's good for us to use for God's purposes. But yet we have to guard ourselves so it doesn't get used for the wrong purposes. Technology itself, well, let me back up. Before there was internet, there was still a problem with pornography. A person's heart, their flesh, starts out evil and desiring wrong things. Technology just makes it easier to see. Or technology makes it easier to display and find out what is inside someone by their actions. The desire is there, regardless of the technology or not. Human nature is sinful with or without technology. Matthew 16:26 says this, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" What is our soul worth? What is your soul worth before God? Technology is amazing and wonderful, but remember that it is our tool. We are to use it for God's purposes, and it's never our toy for us to use ourselves. How can we guard ourselves against this? Well, the first thing is discipline. If we are careful and disciplined, then we'll understand the battle and keep ourselves accountable. Discipline is important in the life of a disciple. Our self-control in one area will help our self-control in others. Along with discipline includes a vibrant relationship with God and others. Not just how many internet friends I have. And to succeed in the battle, we must want victory. We must want to succeed. Accountability to someone else. When I was young, my father knew every single sin in my life, along with my pastor. Now that I'm married, I share it with my wife as well. I recommend to you that you talk to your parents, you talk to your pastors about things. Because in my experience, people cannot be free from the sorts of sins that we've talked about just by coming to a youth conference and repenting. No, it has to involve accountability, the specifics, and cleansing from that, and being responsible for it. Accountability doesn't mean that it's someone else's responsibility. In other words, I can't go to someone and say, keep me accountable for being pure on the internet. Well, that puts the responsibility on them. And then when I go and do something wrong, I think, oh, well, it's their fault because they didn't ask me about it. No, accountability starts with myself and my responsibility before God, asking somebody to help me in that process and going to them and sharing with them the things I'm struggling with so that I can be careful with my own soul. If I don't want accountability, it's an indication that my heart is not right before God. I heard one pastor in our brotherhood mention about another pastor why he was so careful in doing something. And the idea was that this one pastor probably had a weakness in that area, and so that's why he's very careful when he encounters it. But yet I really respected that pastor because I think that the fact that he was doing those things showed me that that pastor's purity was more important than the inconvenience for him to be careful with it. 75% of pastors in the U.S. do not make themselves accountable to anyone for their internet use. This just opens them up to temptation, to slander, and failure. If we are preachers at church, we have an even greater responsibility to live holy as an example. For any unmarried young people here, make sure you have the victory in this before marriage. I've met with so many people who thought that marriage would solve their problems. And instead of solving it, they just brought a problem into their future life. So, how do I practically do this in my family? I'll try to go quickly. These are 5 different things. Number 1, we heard about this before, our computer is in an open location. So it's not hiding somewhere away where somebody else doesn't see it. Also, in my family, we all share the same logins. Well, not exactly the same login, but in my family, all of our passwords follow a mathematical formula based on the site we're logging into. And my wife knows that formula, and I know that formula, so we have no secret passwords for any of our accounts. She can look, I can look. There's nothing that's secret. We also have ad blockers. The ad blockers take care of most of the things on a web page that would pop up that I might not have control over. Takes care of advertisements. Simple, easy, and yet keeps us from having trouble there. We also have a software called Covenant Eyes, which doesn't allow a connection to the internet unless it goes through them. So my work computer, our home computer, our telephones can only access content through this particular site, and you can't go around it. And it logs everything that we ever search for. The time, the date, what it returned. And it keeps track, and it looks for things that could be objectionable. And on top of that, we have a filter that then goes through and it blocks and doesn't allow anybody in my family to access a website that that filter thinks is inappropriate for anybody over the age of 13. I'm a little bit older than 13. But that's the standard that I have in my life for our family. The $3.80 we spend for this service is worth it for me, my family, and our purity. $3.80 a week for everybody in my family. And I talked with the company, and we actually have a discount that you'll see later on if anybody else is interested in that. What it does is it keeps track of everything, and then it sends out a report to whoever I choose to go and look at every single thing, log every time anything access something online, whether it's through a web browser, whether it's through email, and it watches things like that. Why? Because my purity is worth that. I don't think that I'm too strong to be successful in this. I want to have those boundaries. I want to have those walls. By statistics, we have a problem with pornography. This is not something to hide. It's something that we need to face. I'll talk about this. I guess that's what I was mentioning about Covenant Eyes itself and what it does. In Africa, young warriors, when they're taught how to hunt a lion, are taught that the moment the lion roars, that's when they have to go in and attack it. Satan is roaring right now for your family and my family, for your eyes and my eyes. Now is the time to take steps to go in and attack Satan before he attacks us. We are in a battle for our lives. Will it be easy? No. Will you have temptations? Yes. Can you be victorious? Absolutely. There is hope. There is a way. Plan ahead and train. Proverbs 28:13 says, "He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy." A sure sign of a living church is one where members confess sin and turn from it. There's nothing to be ashamed of in confessing our sin before God. God knows it already. That's where we can have victory. Church is not a museum where only perfect people live. No, church is a hospital where we as sick sinners can find help and help each other. That is what's available for us. We are in that battle. Are we going to fight that fight? Do we run to Jesus for forgiveness? Or do we try to cover our sins so that not only do we not prosper, but we lose our very souls in the process? Or do we understand that there is mercy, there's pardon? God wants us to live a life. Everything that Satan has trying to tempt us with, God has a plan that's so much better, so much more fulfilling, so much more useful for our lives than anything that Satan's trying to copy. And my prayer is that each one of us would choose what is right. In the end, after we pray, we're going to take a moment to pray, and then I'm going to pass out the exam I told you about. This exam has multiple questions for you to think about. It also has some of the points that I talked about today. This exam is not something that you give back to me. This exam allows you to look in your own life and see what are areas where technology has influenced me. And then take this form with you to your parent, to your pastor, and go over it with them so that they can help you live a life that is pure, a life that is victorious before God. We'll close in prayer, and then we'll turn it over to the other brothers for some last remarks. Let's kneel to pray.